Welcome back to another installment of our Theobites. I'm Zach Patkey. We've got Sean Mustian. We've got Zach Deacon here once again, and we're examining yet another apparent contradiction brought out from atheist.org, and we find it in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. The category is family relationships. How do we treat our family? Exodus 24, verse 12, one of the Ten Commandments says, honor thy father and thy mother. And then Luke chapter 14, verse 26, the atheist website brings out, if any man comes to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. That is Luke 14:26. And so what the question is, and the challenge is the Bible consistent in how we are to treat our family? Not just parents, but you also note your brothers and sisters as well within this context. And how does all of that work?
I think this is one of the simplest ones that we've done so far.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, like Father's Day is coming up. And so we can just essentially...
We just finished Mother's Day.
We just had Mother's Day yesterday as we're recording, but soon Father's Day is going to be upon us. And I would just encourage people to write a nice note to their father and just say, hey, I want to honor you, and Jesus says I need to hate you. So my means of honoring you is I hate you. So
bold letters underlined.
That's what we call good Bible study, good exegesis. That's how we do that, right? We put it all together in that way. So... honoring your father and mother. How would you start with that? I want to hand it over to Sean to kind of start explaining that.
Okay, so honor the father and mother. I'm going to speak into the Luke text, because honor the father and mother, that's the command given to God's people regarding relationships toward their parents, particularly, and authority in general. But then Jesus gives us these words regarding discipleship. If any man comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, and a few other relations are mentioned, and his own life, he cannot be my disciple.
That's
so
important.
The first thing I would mention is that if we find Jesus' words offensive or excessive, first, we need to pause and realize that we are wrong. So if we hear Jesus saying, you need to hate your father and your mother, and we're like, whoa, this isn't right. Jesus said it. So number one, realize that you're wrong. And reevaluate the text. I get it that something seems kind of off, but let's realize that if we're judging Jesus' words, we're wrong.
Yeah.
So we're not understanding it. So reevaluate. Now, in line with that, Exodus is addressing an earthly series of relationships, as I mentioned. However, Luke is making use of that system of relationships to show the great significance of a discipleship relationship to Christ. So true enough, on earth, naturally speaking, apart from marriage, the relationship of a child to parents is significant, one of the greatest, I would say the greatest apart from marriage, which is a covenant relationship. But Jesus runs with the significance of that to show how much more significant discipleship is. So let me just do a few observations of the context here in Luke real quick. So first thing I want us to see about Luke 14, starting back in verse 7, I'm not going to read everything leading up to this point, but in chapter 14, verse 7, people are acting pretty haughtily, pretty pridefully at a feast that Jesus is attending. And they are kind of assuming they can sit in seats of honor at this feast. And as Jesus observes this, he tells a parable to teach that his disciples must put others first and wait for God to honor them. So that speaks into the part of Jesus' teaching on discipleship later in the chapter that we're talking about, where he says, even denying your own self. So prior to Jesus' words about hate, he is already giving us some background to what's going on here. So he sees people acting haughtily, and he's telling his disciples, you need to be humble. He tells a parable that portrays this. But then the parable kind of continues with the second part, and this is what we find in verses 12 through 24, where we find people loving the world and not the Lord. Let me read these few verses to get this in our head, because this will play a huge role in what it means to hate. Yeah. Jesus said to him, to a person there at the feast, he's telling this parable, Jesus said to him, a man once gave a great banquet and invited many. And at the time for the banquet, when it came, he sent his servant to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is now ready. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, I have bought a field, and I must go out and see it. Please have me excused. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to examine them. Please have me excused. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. That's the end of the quote there. This exemplifies a hatred of the one, that being God, who invites by putting earthly treasures first. So before we get to these words of Jesus about hating father and mother, he's given us some pictures as to what this idea of hatred looks like. In the parable, people are pushing God away because of earthly treasures. They are hating God and loving what they have, even the relationships. It talks about a man who's just married. So with that in mind, Jesus' words regarding hatred of family and even life itself is to be taken in light of the parable surrounding it to call us to a right line of thinking about our priorities. Yeah. So this is kind of a theme of Luke where he uses drastic examples, or he records Jesus using drastic examples to create a picture, a severe picture, and in this case, the severe love we are to have for God as an antithesis of what Jesus was seeing around him at this banquet, which he then kind of republishes through this parable. Again, people saying, I don't want the king, I don't want the Lord, because I have these things. And Jesus says, you got to flip that perspective if you're going to be a disciple of mine. So in the same way we see hatred played out previously by a hatred toward God, and so that they can favor the things of the world, Jesus is saying your mind has to be changed to where your love and favor of God has to make it seem or look as though you hate your father and mother. So the context really brings us into this and really helps us understand what Jesus means by hate.
What is the word for, I mean, there's a specific term for like trying to distance yourself from like all desire. Do you know what that is? Do you guys know? Do you remember what
Asceticism?
that is? Yes.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah. I think that what Jesus is not saying is that. You know, and I really appreciate what Sean said, because as I'm reading the passage, I'm listening to him and I'm like, oh yeah, he's totally right, because of there are other connections that Sean didn't mention that just off the coattails of what he says. You know, Jesus is saying, count the cost. What king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, will not first sit down and consider whether he is strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter one coming against him with 20,000? Yeah. In verse 33, Jesus doesn't use the word hate, but you could argue that still saying all his own possessions. So then, this is verse 33, so then none of you can be my disciple who does not give up all his own possessions, is still just as drastic as saying what he said in 26, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father. Jesus is not arguing, what is it again, asceticism?
Asceticism, yeah.
Yeah, he's
like
not
a monk.
Yeah, he's not arguing that you literally don't own anything anymore,
right,
and you walk around as an impoverished monk. For me, no, he's saying count the cost. You have to flip your priority,
right.
And even the warning. And I'm thinking about this and all this in the context of what Jesus is warning in 34 and 35 of chapter 14. Therefore, salt is good, but if even salt has become tasteless, with what will it be seasoned? It is useless either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown out.
Yeah. So
that if you don't count the cost and have your priorities right as a disciple of Christ, you're useless.
Yeah. Yeah. I would bring out, like you guys just hit at everything that I wanted to bring out from that text. I especially want to highlight the idea that Jesus is bringing forth the difficulties of being his disciple, because right after he says hate father and mother, he also says, if whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. The radical nature of what it is to be a disciple. And then he brings up two occasions where it's talking about war and hardship and difficulty, where he talks about what happens if somebody doesn't count the cost when he's building a tower. He doesn't, which is often used in war, or a king when he goes out to battle. He doesn't bring enough people. He's going to be considered foolish. And for those who would claim to be followers of Christ and yet are not considering a willingness to listen, when you're truly a Christian, if you are truly a Christian, you're dead to these things. Mm-hmm. You're dead to the will of father and mother, especially if that will is against the one who has redeemed you, against Christ. You're dead to the desires of your brother and sister who might try to pressure you not to follow Christ because you're his, and you're his disciple.
Could we even take it one step further? They're comparing it to the law again, Exodus 20.
Yeah.
That the 10 Commandments are broken down into 2 sections.
Yeah.
Love God
Yeah.
and love neighbor. In that order.
That's good.
You know, you love God and then you love neighbor.
Right.
And you can't love neighbor unless you love God.
Which fits exactly what Jesus said about the law, right? Summed up in those 2 commandments,
Yeah.
love the Lord your God, and the second,
Yeah.
love your neighbor as yourself, putting
Yeah.
those 2 things in order. Yeah, really good. I mean, I had a lot to say about the nature of honoring your father and mother transcends testaments. I mean, it's everywhere. You go into the Old Testament law, but you also look into the New Testament. 2 Timothy 3 describes the evils of disobedience to parents being characteristic of the end times, the latter days, where it says, in the last days difficult times will come. Men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, and so on and so forth. All those things. This is something that Paul is clearly identifying as a wicked behavior, to be disobedient to parents. So to say that when Jesus is saying this, you have to understand that in light of the rest of Scripture. Understand what it says about obedience to parents and so on. So,
I mean, what would you guys say in closing? What would you guys say to if you got, the guy? Let's just say the guy running the website. If he was here with us, listening to us in person. I mean, what would you say to him? Like, hey, brother, like, yeah, count the cost. Like, you have to understand that all of these things you're trusting in or treating as God are going to, go back to Ecclesiastes. Everything is gonna, your neighbor. How I've generalized Ecclesiastes to, even in conversations with my wife before. It's like, I think I need to enjoy what God has given me, but at the same time, Ecclesiastes teaches that I'm going to die and my neighbor's going to get my stuff.
right.
So
Right.
So don't just
Yeah. Well, there's one thing that transcends time and eternity, and that is a right relationship with Christ. The rest of these things, your father and mother, your sister, your family, your possessions, all these things will be lost in this life. You'll be separated from them. And so when we think through that statement about not being his disciple or cannot be his disciple, Jesus is actually offering something that is of much greater value when he offers himself beyond familial relationships and earthly possessions. And so that would be one thing you could move it toward the gospel in that way for somebody who would be along this line. So,
yeah, amen. Cool.
Yep. Well, we could talk more about that a little bit later on. So thank you so much for joining us on this Theobite. Lord bless you. Have a great rest of your day.